The United States Congress affirms that Houthis can become members of the international community. The United Nations announces additional humanitarian aid for Yemen. In violation of the international law, Houthis recruit African refugees and send them to war fronts. Welcome to Yemen Today TV. This is the English news with me, Roshan Fouad. Members of the U.S. Congress from both parties condemned Houthi militia's breach of the U.S. Embassy and the arrest of its U.S. current and former locally employed staff, and said this act must not be tolerated. In a joint statement, members of Congress said that Houthis have no interest in peace, nor in making the changes necessary to become legitimate members of the international community. The members added that Houthi rebels' offensive against Ma'rib has upended countless Yemeni lives, triggered fresh waves of displacement, and deepened the world's worst humanitarian crisis. Turning to Ma'rib, local authorities opened 16 new camps in Al-Medina and Al-Wadi to accommodate large numbers of displaced people. Local authorities called on the United Nations to tackle imbalances in the relief organization's performance, adding that displaced people from Rahaba, Mahliya, Harib, Abdiyah and El Juba are living in tragic humanitarian conditions. The ongoing war in Yemen has made it the worst humanitarian situation in recent times, despite the United Nations' efforts to help alleviate the suffering of people. The UN has announced an additional aid recently. More on this story is in the following report.
The United Nations announced the allocation of $45 million to support humanitarian operations in Yemen, in light of the increasing needs and the deterioration of the humanitarian situation due to the escalation of fighting. This amount also comes to ensure decent living conditions for the displaced and other vulnerable groups in Yemen that are in dire need for basic life necessities. In recent months, the pace of military operations has increased on several fronts, especially in the Ma'rib Governorate, which the Houthi militia is trying to control. This has led to an unprecedented wave of displacement and aggravated the human suffering of the population. In this context, Stéphane Dujarric, spokesman for the Secretary General of the United Nations, warned that more than 450,000 people would be displaced if the current fighting reached the center of Ma'rib Governorate.
Yemen still needs a massive aid operation. So far, aid agencies have received about 55% of funding they require this year. This has helped to keep the famine at bay and achieve other important results, but money is quickly running out. Humanitarians also need to be able to do their work safely and without interference.
These conditions could rapidly deteriorate, and if the fighting reaches the city, it could displace another 450,000 people. The United Nations continue to call for an immediate end to the Ma'rib offensive and a ceasefire throughout Yemen. Yemen has been witnessing war for more than 7 years. This has resulted in the worst humanitarian crisis in the world, and 80% of the population has become dependent on support and aid. If the situation continues for the next couple of years without the international organizations moving towards a solution, Yemen will steer into an unknown path.
In Hadramaut, the Interior Minister Major General Ibrahim Haidan met with the United Nations Humanitarian Coordinator in Yemen, David Gressly. Haidan discussed with Gressly efforts of international organizations and possibility of opening offices for humanitarian organizations in the liberated governorates. On his part, David Gressly confirmed that his visit aims to evaluate the humanitarian situation in Yemen and decide on areas of intervention for UN and international organizations. Local authority in Al-Wadi and Al-Sahra districts discussed with the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs in Yemen, increasing the humanitarian support for displaced people in the two areas. The UN team stated that the office is in process of evaluating the humanitarian needs and requirements for next year and seeking ways to meet them. The UN team added that international support is provided according to priorities on the ground, appreciating the initiatives of local authority and its positive interventions that can end people's suffering. government forces defeated Houthi militia from several locations south of Ma'rib. According to sources, government forces carried out an attack targeting several locations in Harib front. Sources added that the artillery targeted Houthi fixed and mobile sites in separate areas of Juba front, which resulted in the death and injury of dozens of the rebels. Few sources indicated that more than 20 Houthis were killed during the battles. In addition, the coalition announced that it carried out 42 operations targeting Houthi militia in Sirwah and El Baida during the past 24 hours. The coalition said the targeting operations destroyed 17 Houthi military vehicles and killed 186 elements. In El Dola, joint forces and southern resistance thwarted an infiltration attempt by Houthi militia members, as 5 of those elements were wounded and killed northeast of El Hasha. Field military sources indicated that clashes erupted with light and medium weapons, pointing that joint forces deterred Houthi militia and inflicted heavy losses on them. Turning to Taiz, the coalition fighters destroyed a Houthi launchpad for ballistic missiles. According to military sources, coalition air jets carried out 2 air raids on the positions of the coup militias in Oman Mountain in El Hauban. Houthi militia pushed military reinforcements from areas under its control towards Hodeidah. Sources reported that Houthi militia pushed members, most of them from Damar, towards Hodeidah. During the past days, Houthi militia sent more troops from several areas under their control and moved them towards Ma'rib front. In violation of the international law and norms, Houthi rebels have started recruiting African refugees in Yemen and sent them to war fronts to fight for them. More details on this story are within this report.
The situation of the marginalized people worsened even more during the war, as this minority faced a real danger due to the Houthis mobilizing many children and youth of this category to the camps and pushing them to the battlefronts, under the name Bilal's descendants, as a racist term added to the groups of terms that they call, where many of them were killed and wounded in a war in which they have no power. The marginalized are the dark-skinned, and the majority of the people of this segment, estimated at 3 million people or 12% of the population of Yemen, who live under extremely dangerous educational and health conditions because of the racial discrimination that is practiced on them socially and politically, taking advantage of the state of ignorance, extreme poverty, fear, and the urgent need of the young men and women of this category to secure food for their families. They are deprived of the enjoyment of the most basic human rights and living in settlements built of thatch or tin. Houthi terrorism was not limited to the expulsion and displacement of marginalized people from their dilapidated population centers. Recently, the militia recruited the marginalized and plunged thousands of them into the battlefronts as part of crimes that expose the poorest groups to genocide. After the forced displacement of 300,000 marginalized people from their areas of control, according to studies funded by UNICEF, the Houthis exploited this group in large-scale campaigns of polarization and pushed them to mass death burns, including fighting, digging trenches, and transferring weapons after the great deficit in ranks of its fighters. The head of the union concerned with the defense of the rights of the marginalized explained that the militias deceived those people by calling them Bilal's descendants as part of their religious propaganda to integrate them into society, but in the end, it recruited them to face their inevitable fate on the death fronts. Houthi militia pushed hundreds of these children to the outskirts of Ma'rib and Al-Jawf, which are the burning fronts, where many of them returned to their families with dead bodies. The Yemeni human rights defender called on the United Nations organizations concerned with the affairs of minorities and refugees to protect the marginalized from the danger of the Houthi war, which pursues ethnic cleansing, human trafficking, and exploitation of their lives in its absurd wars. We call on the United Nations to carry out its humanitarian and moral duties regarding these crimes against children and marginalized people, and to stop the Houthi militias' exploitation of the living conditions of this segment, and their use as fuel for the battles that target the security of Yemen, the region, and the world.
The High Commissioner for Refugees called on the Yemeni government to provide and renew documents for all registered refugees. According to UNHCR, approximately 3,400 refugees and asylum seekers received assistance with registration and documentation, and these mainly included newborns registered by their parents and refugees who renewed their cards. Coming next. Healthy deadly mines continue to claim civilian lives in Maghreb.
اضطرينا ان نغادر من ذي ونزحنا.
الله يستمكنكم يا محويتني لا الله يستمكن.
Welcome back. Healthy deadly mines in Ma'rib and Al-Jawf cities have made hundreds of people handicapped. Those who survive it live in fear that any moment can be trapped in such latent mines. The following report sheds light on some of those affected by healthy mines.
Mines, a terrorizing machine that snatch civilians' lives and leave disabilities that accompany victims for their life journey. This threat will remain as long as Houthi militia continues to plant minefields in roads, farms and populated areas. For more than a year and a half, Jalal Muhammad has been receiving adequate health care and prosthetic limbs after he was hit by explosive devices in Al-Jawf, which caused the amputation of his lower limb. Jalal practices daily walking on these prosthetic limbs to get used to walking on them instead of the wheelchair he used for a whole year.
I was injured due to an explosive device explosion. First, my eyes were affected, then my feet. Everyone here is disabled. We can't walk. We lost our lives. We lost our studies. We can't visit our relatives or go out to public markets. There are many disabled children and women in Al-Jawf. The mines they planted are many in the markets and in the deserts. There is no safety on the roads. People walk on the roads and they are afraid of mines.
The prosthetic limb center in Marib is the only center that covers needs of Marib, Al-Jawf and neighboring governorates for war injured, including civilians and military personnel. Number of cases reached 16,201, an average of 82%, considering the two governorates are among the most filled by Houthi militia with explosive devices and mines. Meanwhile, center is still receiving new cases today from Haljuba, Khub al-Sha'f and the road linking Marib with Al-Yatama.
نقوم هنا بصناعة أطراف علوية سفلية فوق الركبة تحت الركبة.
Here we produce upper and lower limbs above the knee or below the knee for all ages. We receive young people, elderly children. 2 women, we have received about 10 cases.
استقبلنا في مركز الأطراف الصناعية والعلاج الطبيعي في محافظة مأرب من 2015.
Since 2015, we received more than 4,500 mine-affected cases in the artificial limbs and physiotherapy center in Ma'rib Governorate. Governorates most affected by war and mines are Ma'rib and Al-Jawf. Since August, we've received approximately 70 cases from only Abdiya and Juba.
In this training hall, the scale of the catastrophe and the nightmare that haunts Yemenis is evident as a result of healthy minds. The Yemenis attempt to rehabilitate the injured through the therapeutic courses and psychological rehabilitation to start their new lives, though it's different from their used-to-be lives. But this brings new hope for them and great joy, as it facilitates their freedom of movement and roaming instead of forced sitting on bed and wheelchairs. Over the past years, healthy minds have left thousands of Yemenis with aches and pains. This constitutes a great burden over therapeutic centers that receives dozens of people injured daily due to mines.
Vulnerable women are those who bear the cost of wars anywhere, and Yemen is no exception. Thousands of women are malnourished and have poor health due to shortage of food. More details on the suffering of Yemeni women amid war are within this report.
In Yemen, after 7 years of war, 80% of the population is in need of aid. But it's women who have been suffering the most by the conflict. This conflict worsened the situation with assaults and abuse, targeting women increased to 63%, according to the United Nations. International Rescue Committee teams working in Yemen have found that adolescent girls are among the most vulnerable Yemenis. With the crisis disrupting water systems, local markets, and Houthis violating women, they face increased danger as they collect supplies for their families or travel greater distance to access basic services. In Yemen, the stress of daily life amid conflict and economic collapse, as well as shift in gender roles as women seek work outside the home to support their families, has led to a sharp increase in domestic violence. The conflict also has reversed 2 decades of progress on increasing girls' access to education, as more than 36% of girls are missing out on school. Too often, girls are forced to drop out of school and marry early as a coping mechanism to deal with hunger. Gender-based violence and abuse are widespread and go largely unreported. In addition to this crisis, a proposed law setting 18 as the minimum age for marriage and for girls to remain in school has been abandoned. Pregnant and lactating women are suffering from severe acute malnutrition and falling victims of diseases. Despite all the suffering, these strong women will stop at nothing to build a better future for themselves and their families.
The National Committee Against Coronavirus announced 6 new cases of the COVID-19 in 3 governorates. Committee officials said on Twitter that 3 cases were recorded in Lahj, 1 in Aden, and 1 in El Dala. Also 2 deaths were recorded, plus 7 recovered cases. With the current updates, the total confirmed cases are 9,918, including 1,923 deaths and 6,623 cases of recovery. Here's a reminder of the main headlines. The United States Congress affirms that Houthis can become members of the international community. The United Nations announces additional humanitarian aid for Yemen. In violation of the international law, Houthis recruit African refugees and send them to war fronts. This brings us to the end of the news. It was Roshan Fouad. Thank you for watching.